Rome was the most powerful city on earth, but it was also one of the most dangerous places to live. By the 1st century CE, more than 1 million people were packed into its streets, bound together by food handouts, spectacle, rumor, and fear. There were no cameras, no police patrols, no modern surveillance. And yet, the emperors ruled. A careless joke, a poorly timed cheer, or a whispered complaint could end a life, or erase it from history altogether. Public executions were staged as entertainment. Accusations spread faster than evidence. Loyalty was performed loudly, because silence could be mistaken for dissent. This was not chaos, it was design. Roman emperors learned that they did not need to control everyone, only to make everyone feel controllable. Fear was applied selectively, visibly, and unpredictably, just enough to remind the population where power truly lived. This is not a story of madness or cruelty alone. It is a story of systems, of how fear was engineered, maintained, and weaponized to rule millions, long before modern states learned to do the same. Chapter 1. A city too big to control. By the early 2nd century CE, Rome was the largest city the ancient world had ever seen. Modern estimates place its population at over 1 million people, drawn from every corner of the empire: Italy, North Africa, Gaul, Greece, Syria, and beyond. It was a city of extreme density. Towering apartment blocks, narrow streets, and constant movement. Grain shipments from Egypt had to arrive on time to prevent famine. Crowds filled forums, bathhouses, and temples every day. Yet despite its size, Rome had nothing resembling a modern police force. Order was maintained by a fragile patchwork of institutions. A small number of urban cohorts and the Praetorian Guard existed, but their primary loyalty was to the emperor, not to public safety. Magistrates enforced law during the day. At night, the city was largely left to itself. Fires, riots, and mob violence were constant threats. History records several moments when crowds turned political anger into destruction, most famously during the riots that followed food shortages or unpopular imperial decisions. For the emperor, this posed an almost unsolvable problem. He ruled an empire of tens millions, but he lived surrounded by a population that vastly outnumbered the forces directly under his control. Laws alone were insufficient. Armies were stationed far from the capital. Any prolonged unrest in Rome could threaten legitimacy itself, as emperors were made, or unmade, by public perception in the capital. Fear emerged as the most efficient solution. Not fear applied everywhere at once, but fear applied selectively, visibly, and unpredictably. The goal was not to terrorize constantly, but to remind the population that consequences could be sudden and absolute. Rome did not need to watch everyone all the time. It only needed to ensure that everyone believed they could be watched at any time. The central question facing every emperor was simple, and deeply dangerous: how do you control a city that could overwhelm you in a single day if it ever stopped being afraid? Chapter 2. Fear as a political technology. Roman emperors did not rely on fear as an uncontrolled force. They refined it into a political instrument. Violence in Rome was rarely spontaneous at the highest level. It was calculated, staged, and timed. The difference between random brutality and effective rule was intention. Emperors understood that chaos frightened people, but uncertainty controlled them. This system relied on visibility. Punishment was public, not hidden. Executions were conducted in forums, arenas, and along major roads. Trials of senators and elites were recorded and discussed openly. When Emperor Tiberius allowed accusations of treason to flourish under the law of maiestas, the purpose was not merely to punish dissent, but to demonstrate how easily status, wealth, and protection could disappear. No rank was immune. And that message mattered more than the individual sentences themselves. Unpredictability was equally important. Roman punishment was not consistent, and that inconsistency was deliberate. One offense might be ignored, another punished harshly. Some critics survived, others vanished. This randomness prevented people from calculating safety. When outcomes could not be predicted, obedience became the safer option. Spectacle completed the system. Fear worked best when paired with ritual and repetition. Public punishments were formal, slow, and unmistakable. Crowds were forced to watch, absorb, and remember. These events transformed state violence into shared experience, reinforcing collective awareness of imperial power. Crucially, fear reduced the need for constant enforcement. The emperor did not need soldiers on every street corner. The memory of punishment did the work instead. Romans governed themselves by anticipation, moderating speech, behavior, and loyalty based on what they had seen happen to others. In this way, fear became sustainable. It conserved resources, discouraged rebellion before it formed, and allowed emperors to rule enormous populations without permanent military occupation. Rome's control did not depend on omnipresence. It depended on belief that power was watching, listening, and always capable of acting. Chapter 3: The Arena, Turning Violence into Loyalty. The Roman arena was not merely a place of entertainment. It was a central instrument of social control. Gladiatorial games, public executions, and animal hunts were state-sponsored events, funded and organized by emperors who understood their political value. By the 1st century CE, these spectacles were among the most regular and anticipated features of urban life in Rome. Gladiatorial combat had evolved from private funerary rituals into massive public performances. Under emperors like Augustus and later Trajan, games could last for weeks and involve thousands of fighters. The violence was real, tightly regulated, and ritualized. Fighters were trained professionals, owned by the state or wealthy patrons, and their deaths followed structured rules. This order mattered. The arena presented violence as controlled, purposeful, and sanctioned by authority. Executions were often integrated directly into these events. Criminals, prisoners of war, and those condemned for treason or sacrilege were killed publicly, sometimes reenacting mythological punishments. The message was unmistakable. The state possessed absolute power over the body. Death was not hidden or shameful, it was instructional. These spectacles served a critical psychological function. They redirected public anger away from the emperor and toward designated enemies, criminals, outsiders, or traitors. The crowd did not merely observe punishment, it participated emotionally. Cheering reinforced loyalty. Gratitude followed generosity. As emperors who provided lavish games were seen as benefactors, fear and fascination worked together. The same crowds that feared imperial power also relied on it for food, distributions, and entertainment. In the arena, the emperor appeared as both protector and executioner. Violence, carefully staged, became a tool not of repression alone, but of cohesion, binding the population to the authority that controlled life, death, and spectacle itself. Chapter 4: Informants, Whispers, and Paranoia. Fear in imperial Rome did not rely solely on public violence. It thrived in private spaces, carried through conversations, rumors, and accusations. Central to this system was the practice of denunciation. Individuals known as delatores informed authorities about alleged treason, sedition, or insults against the emperor. Under certain emperors, especially Tiberius and Domitian, these informants were encouraged and rewarded. The legal framework made denunciation dangerous and effective. The charge of maiestas, originally meant to protect the dignity of the Roman state, expanded to include speech, writings, and even private remarks about the emperor. A careless comment at a dinner party could be reported and prosecuted. Tacitus records how senators and equestrians lived in constant anxiety, aware that loyalty was judged not only by actions, but by words overheard and repeated. This atmosphere dissolved trust. Friends, family members, and colleagues could not be assumed safe. The uncertainty was deliberate. Emperors benefited from a society that monitored itself, reducing the need for direct surveillance. Suspicion fractured potential networks of resistance before they could form. The terror of denunciation was often silent. Arrests could occur without warning. Property was seized, reputations destroyed, and exile or execution followed swiftly. Even acquittal offered no safety, as accusations alone could ruin careers and standing. Importantly, emperors did not need denunciations to be accurate. They needed them to be believed. The possibility that anyone might be listening reshaped behavior across Roman society. Speech became cautious. Public loyalty grew exaggerated. In this environment, fear was internalized. Control no longer required constant action from the state. It lived in the minds of the population, sustained by whispers, uncertainty, and the ever-present risk of being heard. Chapter 5, Law, Punishment, and Public Humiliation. Roman law under the emperors was not designed solely to deliver justice. It was designed to demonstrate power. Legal punishment functioned as spectacle, especially when applied to those of status. Trials were public, outcomes widely known, and penalties carefully chosen to send a message beyond the individual defendant. Execution was only one option, and often not the most effective. Exile, known as relegatio or deportatio, removed individuals from public life entirely. Senators and elites could be sent to remote islands, stripped of political rights and cut off from influence. Property confiscation followed, transferring wealth directly to the imperial treasury. These punishments erased a person socially while leaving them alive. To serve as a warning, public humiliation amplified the effect. Being forced to wear mourning clothes, barred from public spaces, or excluded from religious rites signaled disgrace to the entire community. In a society built on honor, reputation, and lineage, this loss could be more devastating than death. Families were marked by association, careers ended overnight, and memory itself was sometimes targeted through damnatio memoriae, the official erasure of a person's name and image. The law's power lay in its visibility. Roman citizens learned not only what was illegal, but what was dangerous to be perceived as disloyal. The legal system blurred into moral judgment, shaping behavior through fear of shame as much as fear of punishment. This approach required no mass incarceration. Instead, it relied on selective enforcement. A few well-publicized cases could discipline thousands. The emperor's authority appeared omnipresent, not because it acted constantly, but because it acted decisively and publicly. Law became less a shield for citizens and more a mirror, reflecting what the state demanded: obedience, silence, and public conformity. Chapter 6, Divine Fear, Emperors as Gods and Omens. Roman emperors did not rely on fear of punishment alone. They extended control into the realm of belief. From the reign of Augustus onward, imperial authority was increasingly framed as divinely sanctioned. Temples were built to honor the genius of the emperor. Sacrifices were offered in his name, and loyalty to the ruler became intertwined with religious duty. This was not sudden deification, but a gradual political strategy. Augustus rejected the title of God during his lifetime in Rome, yet allowed worship in the provinces. After death, emperors were formally deified by the Senate, reinforcing the idea that supreme power carried divine approval. Later rulers, such as Caligula and Domitian, pushed further, encouraging worship while alive and punishing those who resisted. Punishment was often framed as cosmic justice. Disobedience to the emperor was not merely treason, it was impiety. Executions, exile, and disasters could be interpreted as divine responses to moral failure. Public rituals reinforced this connection. When omens appeared, comets, earthquakes, eclipses, they were discussed as signs of imperial favor or warning. Emperors used these moments to assert authority, presenting themselves as intermediaries between Rome and the gods. Superstition strengthened fear in ways law never could. Romans believed deeply in fate, curses, and divine retribution. To oppose the emperor was to risk not only death, but disorder in the universe itself. This belief system discouraged resistance even in private thought. By merging political power with religious meaning, emperors extended control beyond courts and armies. Fear became metaphysical. The state no longer needed to punish every act of disobedience. The gods, it was believed, were watching, and through the emperor, they acted. Chapter 7, When Fear Backfires. Fear was an effective tool, but it carried inherent risk. When used excessively, it destabilized the very system it was meant to protect. Roman history records repeated moments when emperors became victims of the climate they had created. Trapped in cycles of suspicion and violence, paranoia often turned inward. Emperors who relied heavily on terror began to see threats everywhere. Caligula's reign, from 37 to 41 CE, was marked by executions of senators and equestrians on charges that were often vague or symbolic. Domitian, ruling from 81 to 96 CE, expanded treason trials to such an extent that members of his own court feared private conversation. These actions isolated emperors politically, cutting them off from reliable information and loyal supporters. Fear also bred resentment. Public obedience did not mean private loyalty. The assassination of Caligula by members of the Praetorian Guard demonstrated how quickly fear could reverse direction. The same forces meant to protect the emperor became instruments of his removal. Similar patterns followed with Commodus in 192 CE, whose increasingly erratic punishments alienated both elites and officials. At a broader level, excessive terror weakened institutional stability. Informants abused the system for personal gain. False accusations flooded courts. Trust within the administration collapsed. Governance slowed as fear replaced cooperation. Rome's history shows that fear could suppress rebellion, but it could not eliminate ambition or anger. When legitimacy eroded, violence returned, often suddenly and decisively. Control depended on balance. Once fear outweighed consent, the system fractured. The Roman emperors learned, sometimes too late, that terror could rule a city. It could also empty a throne. The line between authority and vulnerability was thinner than it appeared. Chapter 8. The legacy of Roman fear. The Roman Empire did not invent rule through fear, but it refined it with lasting influence. The systems developed by emperors, public spectacle, selective punishment, surveillance through informants, and the fusion of political power with moral or divine authority, became templates for later empires across Europe and beyond. Medieval monarchies, early modern states, and authoritarian regimes would all borrow elements first tested in Rome. Yet Rome's history also exposed the limits of fear as a foundation for power. Emperors who combined authority with legitimacy, such as Augustus or Trajan, used fear sparingly, relying instead on stability, prosperity, and public approval. Their reigns endured. Those who ruled primarily through terror often faced abrupt ends, remembered less for order than for instability and violence. Over time, Rome itself changed. As the empire expanded and later fragmented, the centralized fear that once controlled the capital became harder to maintain. Military power shifted to the provinces. Loyalty moved from institutions to individual commanders. Fear, once effective in the city of Rome, could not scale endlessly across a changing world. The Roman experience leaves a central question unresolved. Fear can command silence, enforce obedience, and delay resistance, but it cannot create trust, loyalty, or permanence. Rome ruled millions without modern weapons, technology, or bureaucracy, but it did so at a cost. In the end, fear proved to be a tool, not a solution. It preserved power in the short term, but undermined it in the long run. The empire endured for centuries, yet its most brutal rulers rarely did. Roman history suggests that fear may be one of the strongest instruments of control, but also one of the most fragile foundations on which power can rest. Rome's emperors proved that fear can build obedience faster than trust, but it also corrodes from within. The empire survived for centuries, yet its most feared rulers rarely did. Power enforced by terror always demands more terror to sustain it, until the system turns on itself. If you want to understand how real power works, how it rises, how it holds, and how it collapses, history is the best teacher. If this story gave you a new perspective on Rome, consider subscribing for more deep documentary-style history grounded in real events. And let me know in the comments, is fear the strongest tool of control, or the most dangerous one?